Paul, unhurt, cast from his hand the viper who had clung to it. Does any Christian expect from this that he may take up the deadly biting serpent and not be hurt? For a Christian to believe any of these things is not faith, but presumption. To argue then from what God has done in extraordinary that he will do so in ordinary circumstances is unsupported by either faith or reason. The extraordinary effects of the gospel in the first ages, though produced irrespective of national support, does not warrant the conclusion that no such support ought now to be made. Still more futile is it to reason from the state of religion in our own country that a national provision is unnecessary. The experiment has been tried, and the result ought to satisfy everyone that it is far from being successful. The religious instruction provided by the spontaneous liberality of people bears no reasonable proportion to the religious wants of the community. The religious statistics of the United States, compared with the entire population, demonstrates the truth of what I have now stated. The remarkable discrepancy which exists between the means of religious instruction and the population has been endeavored to be accounted for by the peculiar state of the Church and the immense addition that is continually making to the population by immigration from other countries. This supposes one of two things: the absence of pecuniary means, or the absence of a gospel ministry equal to the extraordinary growth of the population. The first of these, I presume, will not be said. It is not the boast, and in some respects justly, of our nation that her citizens are less taxed, her peasantry better fed and clothed, and in all respects externally the most comfortable in the world. The circumstances referred to do not prevent the favorable results now mentioned. That new states thinly peopled are in some respects unfavorably situated is admitted. Still, however, so far as external things are concerned, it is claimed, and perhaps truly, that the peasantry of the United States are more comfortable than those of almost any other country. This shows that it is not the want of means, but something else that produces the destitution of sufficient religious instruction. They have the means of increased external comforts, and were the desire of obtaining religious instruction equally strong, it would be equally within their reach. Nor can the destitution be charged upon an inadequate supply of ministers of religion, for however inadequate their supply may be to the wants of the population, the supply is much greater than the demand. A large number of the ministers of the gospel in the United States are without pastoral charge. One half, or nearly one half, for example, of the ministers of the General Assembly connection are in this condition. The greater part of these being compelled to abandon their pastoral charges on account of inadequate means of support. And to this may be added the fact that a vast number, not only of unsettled ministers, but of those having charge of congregations, are engaged as teachers in schools and academies. The gospel ministry is not in general adequately supported, and therefore frequently pastors of congregations as well as unsettled ministers are under the necessity of supporting themselves by teaching or otherwise. This shows that when the support of the gospel is left to the impulse of individual liberality, it is vain to expect inadequate provision. It shows the absence of a felt necessity of religious instruction, To meet this indifference of religion, a public provision should be made for the support of the gospel. Secondly, leaving the support of religion to the spontaneous liberality of a community without any public provision is obnoxious to very serious practical objections. It is not only true that religion, as has been shown, will have only a very secondary consideration with even a large portion of professors, and with the great mass of society scarcely any consideration at all. This fact, so extensively illustrated, sufficiently shows the necessity of some more permanent and secure provision. I refer now particularly to the effects of depending entirely on a spontaneous provision. First, it may materially affect the independence of the ministers of the gospel. There are few men endowed with moral courage and piety enough to resist all temptation on this score. When a man knows or has strong reason to suspect that certain opinions may not be agreeable to many, or even to a very few influential individuals in his congregation, he is under temptation either to conceal or only partially urge such opinions publicly, lest his pecuniary interests should suffer. The same reason may make him sinfully cautious in reproving the neglect of duty or censuring vice. I have known it given as a reason for ministerial neglect of a plain scriptural rule that public opinion would not bear its application. It is not necessary, nor do I refer to illustration of this point to unprincipled men, who may creep into the ministry of the gospel. Such men will always seek their own temporal interests, and in most cases will be sure of attaining them by false and flattering practices. Whatever safeguards may be thrown around the system, I refer to the temptation to which even good men are exposed by leaving them entirely dependent upon spontaneous liberality for their support. This kind of temptation is remarkably deceitful. It may materially affect a man's opinions and conduct without his being at all aware of it. It is in this secret and unacknowledged influence of the temptation that the great danger lies. No good man would for a moment allow himself to indulge the thought of accommodating his ministerial services to the prejudices or caprices of his congregation, whether in preaching the gospel or in exercising government and discipline. This is, of course, altogether out of the question. But may not many do it without being aware of it? May not all so situated be influenced in some respects, while perhaps they may pique themselves upon their independence of thought and conduct? To deny such effects is to argue but little acquaintance with human character, and savors more of presumption than Christian wisdom and foresight. Such effects may not only result, but all probability is on the side that they will result from the plan of mere spontaneous provision for the support of the gospel. Is it Christian-like, or is it proper to adopt the mode of supporting the gospel that must necessarily expose its ministers to so much temptation to betray all the important and spiritual interests of those committed to their pastoral charge? Is it the dictate of sound policy, as well as Christian morality, to preserve by every proper safeguard the independence of important functionaries, to put and keep them beyond the reach of temptation as far as is possible? The value of this is readily acknowledged in civil society in relation to the administration of justice. Hence, in the state of New York, the Chancellor and Justices of the Supreme Court, and in other states, those and inferior judges, hold their offices during good behavior. They are thus rendered independent of mere popular feeling and prejudice. Is it for the advancement or the advantage of religion or the good of society that the ministers of the gospel are tempted to gratify their prejudices and caprices to those among whom they labor? An important part of their duty is to warn men of sin, to reprove and exhort with all long-suffering. But if such reproofs give offense, as they must often do, is it proper that they, whose official business it is to watch over the spiritual interests of others, should be tempted to neglect so important a duty? Ministers of religion would not be irresponsible for their conduct, though they were rendered independent as to their pecuniary support. They are responsible for official misconduct to the ecclesiastical courts under which they are. And indeed, this is the only responsibility that the case can admit of. To have the means of withholding pecuniary support forms no guarantee whatever to the people that duty will be properly performed. It may act as a temptation to flatter and gratify, but never as an inducement to duty. Section 8. The duties of citizens. Number 1. They owe obedience to the government. The laws and regulations of a lawfully constituted government ought to be respected and obeyed. I do not mean, however, by this that the subjects of law are under obligation to obey every enactment that those having power may choose to impose. I take it for granted in the remark which has been made that the government is not only rightfully constituted, but also rightfully administered. I take it for granted that the laws requiring obedience are right and lawful. Otherwise they have no claim to the people. For claim arises out of the consideration that the thing commanded is in conformity to right. And this being determined, the duty of the citizens is obedience to the law. It is not a blind submission to whatever may be called law. It is intelligent. It judges of the authority to command and of the thing commanded, of the right which is possessed to the command, and of the conformity of the command to the principles of rectitude. For no human authority has a right to impose on the subjects of government anything whatever that is in opposition direct or implied to the revealed will of God. There is reserved then to the citizen the right of discriminating, though it is to be observed that he must exercise this on his own responsibility. His resistance to civil authority is not justifiable merely because he may think so. It must be tried by the law and the testimony. Firstly, obedience is due to civil government because it is a divine institution. The obedience of which I speak is not given if there is a respect to it only as human institution, if it is sustained and obeyed by citizens simply on the ground that it is their own. The principle of obedience is respect to it as a divine institution. That it has pleased God to appoint that men should not live like wild beasts, without government and without subordination, but that they should live in society. So should they do honor to his institution by cheerfully obeying lawful authority, and obeying it too from the principle of conscientious regard to a divinely instituted ordinance, quote, not only for wrath, but also for conscience' sake, unquote. Secondly, because obedience to the laws is necessary to the public welfare. The good of mankind is the immediate and direct end of civil society. Every violation of order or disregard to righteous authority is a direct assault upon the welfare of society, and its obvious tendency is to break up civil order and introduce anarchy and confusion. While regard is to be had to the institution as from God, regard is also to be had to the end which God had in view. Number 2, civil government should be supported. The civil ruler is entitled to remuneration for his services. It does not lie in the way of my present inquiry to ascertain on mere political grounds the advantages or disadvantages of remunerating all who are employed in the respective branches of government, as well as legislative, as executive, and judicial. I proceed on the ground of scriptural equity, that those who serve the community have a right to be supported by the community. Not only have the officers of government a right to be supported, but the government itself needs to be supported, and it is the duty of a people to furnish the means by which the government may be sustained. Quote, for this cause pay you tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually on this very thing, unquote. Romans 13, verse 6. I have a reference, however, not so much to the furnishing of the means of carrying on the government, as to the principle from which it flows. Every government constituted on principles of representation will have provided by its constitution for the means of carrying it on. It is the will of God expressed in Scripture that those who enjoy the advantages of government should cheerfully furnish the support required. As the Scripture requires conscientious obedience to law, it requires also conscientious support of the government. The Constitution or the law will have empowered the compulsion of paying taxes, but submitting to such compulsion is not fulfilling the obligation imposed on citizens by divine appointment. In this matter, they must, quote, must needs be subject not only for wrath, but also for conscience' sake, unquote. Romans 13, verse 5. Number 3, those who bear civil rule are entitled to honor and respect. I speak not of that blind administration approaching to all, which the tyrants of the earth have exacted from their servile servants, on the ground of divine hereditary right or otherwise. This is as far removed from the honor and respect required by Scripture as it is subversive of independence and freedom of thought. It is the will of God that civil rulers should be held in honor and respect. Quote, render fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor, unquote, is due. Romans 13, verse 7. Quote, fear God and honor the king, for so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, unquote. 1 Peter 2, verses 17 and 15. The honor thus commanded is to be given to the king. The honor thus commanded to be given to the king, is due on the same principle to every chief magistrate, whether known by this or any other name. The honor is due not to the man, but to the officer, and that not as known by any mere political distinction, but as possessed of lawful civil power. For while the Scriptures do not determine the particular form, it determines the character of civil government. And wherever this character is possessed, there is lawful power, whether the form may be republican or kingly. It is the character, and not the form of government, that decides whether the power is or is not of a moral, scriptural kind. The honor then is due to a lawful magistrate, whether known by the names governor, president, or king. It is due, however, not only to those who bear chief authority in a state, but to subordinate magistrates in their respective places. The obligation to honor and respect civil rulers flows from the divine. The obligation to honor and respect civil rulers flows from the divine command. They are entitled to honor because they are his ministers.